What I mean is I have a lot of stuff and I don't use it enough, so I'm making
The first
a
kit
video
we have to
that
talk about is the
specifically
DVS
indulges my
drum kit by Dark Boy's got some dope drum kits, especially for a range of beats. What I want to get like
For me, and I'm sure for many of you, this is how it all got started. The good old Shure SM57. These cost about $99 new, you could find one for about $60 used, but this particular one was free because I stole it from my school. But it turns out to use a microphone you need an audio interface, and at the time, I did not have one, and thanks to living in a little podunk farm town, I was not likely to get my hands on one anytime soon. Instead, I fired up my pawn shop laptop, hopped onto the World Wide Web, and grabbed myself a copy of Audacity, and I recorded my songs one layer at a time with my phone's built-in microphone. No metronome, no headphones, no nothing, just raw dogging my way to music one take at a time. Eventually, I saved up my birthday money and such and bought a copy of Mixcraft 4 from Guitar Center, and for a Christmas present, I got my very first field recorder, the Line 6 Backtrack Plus with built-in microphone. With all that, a pair of Walmart earbuds and some of the loops and pretty primitive MIDI programming built into Mixcraft at the time, I was able to make my very first song. It wasn't great, but for a 14-year-old, it was something. There's a lot to be said for resourcefulness as a catalyst for the creative process. Despite not having access to a fraction of the gear I have now, this is maybe the time in my life when I made the most music, because I just had to deal with what I had, and there was not a damn thing on earth that was gonna stop me. Even today, I think the fastest way to get myself out of those creative ruts whenever I fall into them now and again is just to work with what the good Lord gave me here, because the hardest way to make something is to wait until the time is right to do it. For a couple weeks, I worked with my friend David Hillowitz on a new string library for Decent Sampler, where we recorded the sounds of our cellos and violas and violins, and ran those recordings through some of our favorite boutique guitar pedals. After it was all done, I posted a YouTube short about the whole process, and the point of it being to try a dumb idea once in a while, because sometimes they turn out pretty interesting. But on that video, I got a comment from Giovanni Alighieri, hopefully I'm saying that right, that really stood out to me. Giovanni said, "This idea assumes that you have very good mics and preamps in the first place, which is not my case with two NT2 Rhodes and a Scarlett 4i4. Now, what I think is particularly funny about this is that I don't think Giovanni knew I recorded all of my parts for this library using this, an MXL R144 I got used from a Guitar Center about 10 years ago for like $60. Now, granted, the microphone was running into the front of a $1,300 audio interface, but I don't think that was really even necessary. In fact, for the sake of proof, I bet you I could make a new sample library right now for even cheaper. And what do you know, it's a National Post Office Day miracle, Charlie Brown, and whatever, the whole thing's free, download it down there. But there's a better point I wanted to make with all this stuff. Fact of the matter is, there's always going to be a new graphics card. There's always going to be an updated camera lens. There's always going to be a better iPhone. There will always be something new on the horizon that represents maybe some sort of a solution, and the grass is always going to seem a whole hell of a lot greener, which translates to our old familiar friend. In the last couple years, there's been an overwhelming rise of equipment influencer content online, from the barrage of YouTube videos on every embargo drop day to endless social media content about the latest and greatest LUT packs and cord packs and whatever the fuck this thing is supposed to be. As part of researching for this video, I decided to sit down and do a little bit of an experiment, and I'm curious if the results are maybe similar for you out there. I sat down and compared the last year of my YouTube watch history as it relates to gear content as versus the amount of music I had made every month, and it turns out mainlining the flood of content is pretty bad for my ability to actually create anything. Throughout the lifespan of this channel, I've been on kind of both sides of the coin here. On the one hand, as a creator, I was part of the endless embargo day drops of videos of new plugins and gear and whatever, and that was fun for a while, up until you realize it's just not, and it's all part of this kind of content pipeline of sludge nothingness. And as a consumer, seeing all these videos coming out every release day and whatever, you start to realize there's this growing sense of an unspoken rule of don't do, buy. And that's really frustrating. It's maybe worth cutting in here to point out, and maybe this is a bit of a hot take, just because you enjoy collecting gear and instruments and plugins or whatever doesn't mean you need to make music with them. I don't think there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. Just because you bought an expensive mirrorless camera setup and take photos with it once every 8 months, who cares? That's totally fine if you just enjoy that. I've got plenty of instruments and gear and random things laying around my house here that I've never made a single song with, and that's great. I just like having them around, and I play them every once in a while, and it brings me a lot of joy. And if anyone has a problem with that, fuck those people for telling you how to enjoy your own hobby. But that being said, I've found myself sucked down this rabbit hole of gear acquisition syndrome many times. I've even been going through it a bit lately with really wanting to upgrade my camera body very badly. And that's the problem, is when this actively inhibits my ability to create something. And that's the person that this video is for. So that, I guess, brings us to the question, where does gear acquisition syndrome really come from? And more importantly, what can we really do about it? In 2008, Stanford professor Brian Knutson conducted a study on gambling that found that the most significant brain activity related to the activity of gambling was not in the win itself, but in the anticipation of it. And I'm sure that you can identify with that feeling all too well. You see the new thing, you get excited about it, you buy the new thing, you get more excited, you wait and wait, it finally shows up, you get it all put together and hooked up, and it turns out it doesn't make any music on its own. So the natural solution is to buy your new piece of gear, a new piece of gear to be friends with. And that's maybe where the root of the problem comes into play. Justifying behavior that makes no sense whatsoever. There was a really interesting paper from students of Harvard and the University of Michigan written back in 2015 that pointed out that when consumers are presented with an opportunity to upgrade to a new thing, they are prone to act more carelessly with their existing thing by breaking it or losing it or something along those lines because it justifies the act of upgrading to the new thing. And I think all of this really supplements the idea that when we see a flaw in something, we're very prone to exaggerating that flaw if it serves to justify a desired outcome. And all of this really circles back to Freud's idea of defense mechanisms. We tend to act in the interests of ourselves, and we will do a lot to make sure that those acts can be justified to ourselves. I guess the truth that we really don't like to face is that you often need a lot less than you'd think. In the end, it's not about the camera, it's about the photographer behind it. In fact, as I'm sitting here editing this video, I see that just a couple days ago, Heinbach released a whole new album using a Casio SK1 and an iPad. The Casio SK1 is an old sampler keyboard from the 80s that I think you could buy for about $100, and it borders on being a toy, and an iPad is just an iPad. And it's incredibly inspiring to me to think that one of my favorite artists was able to make a whole new body of work with such a limited setup. And I think it really is that almost careless and reckless sense of creativity that we all need to embrace now and again as artists. I mean, sure, the odd bit of fancy gear or high-end plugins can help, but it's never the deciding factor in your ability to just make something right now. And I think that's true of every artist. I'm about 80% certain it was Seneca who said something to the effect of, and I'm probably paraphrasing a bit here, we're so stingy with money and stuff, but we're so easily giving of our time. And that's the one resource we can't make more of, especially by buying a bunch of gear that turns into glorified furniture. I think the thing we forget is we're going to waste so much time waiting around to create something when the only way to be a creative is just to go create stuff. There have been tons of examples of artists using crappy gear because it's all they had access to, or it was just something that inspired them to make incredibly successful releases. Outside of the mega successful acts, it goes without saying that there are countless artists around the world making music and samples and such every single day with even the most basic gear. And if it doesn't inhibit them, then why should your assumed need for something inhibit you? The point of all this being, as long as you have what is truly necessary to the process, then your need for something is only going to hold you back for as long as you let it. So, get off the internet and go make something, I guess, in less words. Or don't. But just remember, whether you do or whether you do not, time is going to pass anyway, and regret for having not tried sure makes suffering with existence a whole lot harder. The end.